Jesse Vance knew the rules of the road. You don't drive tired, you don't ignore a pinging engine, and you never pick up hitchhikers. Driving a 40-ton Peterbilt hauling refrigerated meat across the Navajo Nation is a lesson in isolation. The desert at night is a sensory vacuum. There are no streetlights, no billboards, and radio stations dissolve into static 60 miles out of Gallup. It was just past 2 a.m. when the fog rolled in. It wasn't the thick, wet soup you get near the coast. This was a dry, ghostly vapor that seemed to rise directly from the cracked asphalt, smelling faintly of ozone and old pennies. Jesse slowed his rig down to 40 miles per hour, his eyes straining against the high beams. The figure appeared out of the gray mist like a smudge on a camera lens. Jesse's foot hovered over the brake by pure reflex. It was a girl, standing right on the white shoulder line. She wore a faded denim jacket and a floral sundress that fluttered in the draft of his approaching truck. Her skin was impossibly pale under the amber marker lights of the Peterbilt. She didn't have her thumb out. She was just standing there, staring straight ahead into the dark. "Not tonight, sweetheart," Jesse muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He eased the truck toward the center line, giving her a wide berth. As the cab rolled past, he couldn't help but look down. Her face was locked in a blank, glassy stare, her hair matted with dust. He passed her. The taillights of his trailer painted her in a fleeting red glow before the fog swallowed her whole. Jesse let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He checked his side mirrors to make sure she hadn't stepped into the road behind him. The passenger side mirror showed nothing but the gray wall of mist and the reflective tape on his trailer. He looked up at his rearview mirror. The girl was sitting on his bunk. Jesse's heart slammed into his ribs like a trapped bird. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, turning his breath into a sudden plume of white vapor. The smell of ozone vanished, replaced instantly by the suffocating reek of stagnant water and decaying sagebrush. How the hell? His voice cracked, a pathetic whisper against the roar of the diesel engine. Through the mirror, he watched her. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her knuckles were scraped raw, stained with dark, dried crust. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the dashboard, tracking the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. "Get out," Jesse croaked, his hand shaking so violently the massive steering wheel vibrated beneath his palms. "Hey, I said get out of my truck." She didn't move. She didn't blink. But as the truck rumbled over an expansion joint in the road, her head snapped 90 degrees to the left, staring directly at the side of his skull. Her neck made a sound like dry twigs snapping. Jesse didn't dare turn his head to look at her directly. The rearview mirror was terrifying enough. In the dim green glow of the instrument panel, her skin looked translucent, revealing a web of blackish veins beneath her cheeks. "Look, lady, I don't want any trouble," Jesse stammered, his eyes darting between the foggy road ahead and the mirror. "There's a truck stop in Shiprock. Another 30 miles. I'll drop you there. Just don't move." The radio, which had been dead static for the last hour, suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't a song. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping emergency broadcasts, old weather reports from the 1970s, and a weeping woman screaming a name Jesse couldn't make out. The volume knob turned by itself, twisting to the right until the speakers rattled and tore with the shrieking noise. Jesse reached out to slap the power button, but his fingers froze an inch from the console. The plastic casing of the radio was covered in a thick layer of white frost. The frost was spreading. It crawled across the dashboard like tiny, crystalline spiders, locking the needles of the fuel gauge and tachometer in place. The digital odometer began to roll backward, the numbers spinning into a blur of meaningless digits. "Stop it," Jesse pleaded, tears of pure terror stinging his eyes. "Please." From the sleeper berth behind him, a sound emerged. It was a wet, rattling gasp, the sound of fluid-filled lungs trying to draw air. The girl was leaning forward. He could hear the friction of her denim jacket against the vinyl of his seat. The stench of the grave hit him full force. It was the smell of a body left in the desert sun for weeks, mixed with the sharp scent of copper. He could feel the cold radiating off her skin. It felt like standing next to an open freezer door. Her face moved into his peripheral vision, hovering just inches from his right ear. "You didn't stop," she whispered. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep well, layered with the echoes of a dozen different people. "I'm sorry," Jesse sobbed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I'm sorry." "They never stop," she said.
Jesse risked a glance at the passenger window. The fog outside had turned into a swirling vortex of black dust. The yellow lines on the highway were gone. There was no road anymore, just an endless, empty void of dark sand and twisted mesquite trees that seemed to move on their own. The truck began to accelerate. Jesse slammed his foot onto the brake pedal, but it was stiff, frozen solid against the floorboard. The air brakes hissed in protest, a high-pitched scream of metal on metal, but the truck kept gaining speed. 50 miles per hour. 60. 70. The girl's hands reached around the driver's seat. Her fingernails were torn to the quick, caked with red desert clay. She didn't grab the wheel. Instead, she pressed her palms against Jesse's temples. The touch was agonizing. It felt like 2 blocks of dry ice melting into his skull, freezing his thoughts and locking his jaw tight. Images flooded Jesse's mind, flashes of a memory that wasn't his. He saw a blinding flash of headlights. He heard the screech of a sedan's tires, the horrific crunch of collapsing metal, and the shattering of safety glass. He felt the sensation of being thrown into the ditch, lying in the cold dirt of Route 666, watching a pair of red taillights drive away into the night, leaving her to die alone in the dark. "Help me," she whispered in his ear, her breath icy and dry. "I can't," Jesse choked out, his vision fading at the edges as the intense cold threatened to shut his body down. "I can't change it." The speedometer read 90. The engine was roaring in a pitch that sounded like a dying animal. Up ahead, the highway didn't just curve, it ended. The old bridge over the dry wash had been gone for decades, replaced by a bypass Jesse had somehow missed in the fog. The headlights illuminated a rusted iron barricade and the yawning mouth of a black canyon. Jesse closed his eyes. He thought of his wife, of his kids waiting for him in Albuquerque. He prayed for a quick death. The hands on his temples vanished. The sudden absence of the cold felt like a physical blow. Jesse gasped, his lungs burning as the air in the cab instantly warmed back up. The frost on the windshield melted into a torrent of water, clearing his view just in time to see the iron barricade 10 feet in front of his bumper. With a primal scream, Jesse threw his entire weight onto the steering wheel, ripping it to the left. The Peterbilt jackknifed. The massive trailer swung outward with a deafening screech of tearing metal, tires blowing out one by one as they dug into the dirt shoulder. The rig spun 360 degrees, kicking up a wall of dust and sagebrush before slamming to a halt mere inches from the canyon edge. Silence descended on the desert. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the rhythmic hiss of a severed airline. Jesse sat frozen in the driver's seat for a long time. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, his muscles cramped so tight they felt like stone. Slowly, the dark fog began to lift, dissipated by the first faint rays of dawn bleeding over the eastern mesas. The terrifying void turned back into the familiar, bleak landscape of New Mexico. He turned his head slowly, his neck popping in the quiet cab. The sleeper berth was empty. The vinyl seat was dry. There was no frost on the dashboard, no smell of decay. Jesse unbuckled his seatbelt with trembling fingers and pushed the heavy truck door open. He practically fell out of the cab, his boots sinking into the loose red sand. He leaned against the side of the dented fuel tank, drawing deep breaths of the clean, cool morning air. He walked around to the passenger side of the truck to inspect the damage. The trailer was scraped up, and 3 tires were shredded to ribbons, but he was alive. Then he stopped. On the chrome step leading up to the passenger door, there was a single, perfect handprint. It wasn't made of grease or oil. It was a smudge of wet, red clay, identical to the dirt at the bottom of the canyon. Jesse looked back down the highway. The road stretched out behind him, straight and empty under the morning sun. There was no sign of the girl, no sign of the fog. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed his dispatcher. When the voice answered on the other end, Jesse didn't report the accident. He didn't ask for a tow truck. "I'm done," Jesse said, his voice flat and dead. "Send someone to pick up the rig. I'm never driving Route 666 again." He hung up, threw the phone into the dirt, and began the long walk toward the nearest mile marker, never once looking back at the shadows still lingering under the desert cliffs. Hit like and subscribe now.